Hello again, so I'm back with another tutorial for how to set up or send your Maya scene to the render farm and what parameters you have to be aware of when you are using the master software that we are using here. So this is the scene that I have created and I made the tutorial based off of. I'm having all of these render layers. I'm having everything already created. All the AOVs are created. I'm having some overrides for each one of these layers, and as you can see, for some of them, I'm having some overrides even on the AOVs, as well as the frame range of the scene. So if you remember, we had one single animated object that was the Vespa. So these two render layers are having an override on their end frame for the beauty and the shadow of the Vespa. All right, so let's see what should we do when you want to send this file to the render farm. I have already logged into the master software, and I'm going to show you what you need to do when you want to send your job to Renderfarm. So first, let's start by going over all of these attributes that you're supposed to create when you want to set your project or set your job or prepare your job on the Renderfarm. First of all, I think there is another tutorial that is only related to how to use the master render farm here, but I'm going to just quickly go over all of these attributes that you have to change when you want to submit your job. So the job name is supposed to be the username of your RAT account, so the render wranglers are able to find you based on this account name. So make sure that you use your correct account or username. RAT username here. The engine that you want to use is supposed to be the engine that you are actually setting up your scene. So since we are using Arnold, you will choose Arnold, and then here you will give your job a name. This is for your own information. So since you're gonna have, I guess, sometimes more than one job on the render farm, you can name your jobs here. This is something different than the job name. Again, the job name is supposed to be your username, so the wranglers are able to find you. So for this one, I'm gonna name it Vespa. You should also choose what department you're at. So we are at 3DDDG or DDDD. And then for the job priority, make sure that you're giving your job priority a priority of 99, which means that it's going to have a higher priority compared to other jobs if there's other jobs here for some other purposes. But you're supposed to give your job a priority of 99. You should not use a job priority of 100 because 100 is just reserved for the jobs that are only for testing a scene. So if you want to test your scene and make sure that all the connections are correct, you will put a job priority of 100 and you will only render out your scene for only one frame. We don't want to occupy the render farm with jobs that are having a priority of higher than 99. Again, 100 is only for the jobs that are for testing purposes. You will skip all of these. The next step will be you have to choose accept errors, and also for exit codes and logs errors, make sure that you choose skip both. If you want to put a note here on your job, you can put a note here and everybody can see those notes. The packet size is how many frames is going to be assigned to each one of the computers on the render farm. So if you want to have each one of the computers to take care of, for example, 5 frames of your scene, you can give a packet size of 5 to your job here. Maximum instances, if you want to limit the number of the machines or the workstations that are going to work on your job, you can set a maximum here. By default, the maximum is set to 0, which means that it will find any number of workstations that are available on the render farm and it will use all of them. The next step is to make sure that you're choosing the correct path for your file. So here's something that sometimes students are having problem with, setting the path of their projects. So you have to make sure that you are choosing the correct drive on the render farm, which means that it has to start with W, the letter W. and you can always click on this browse button. Right now I'm using the master machine, master software at home, so the drives that you're seeing here are going to be different than yours. So you're supposed, this is supposed to point you at the W drive. If you can't see the W drive, make sure that you will dig into your Explorer and then find the W drive, and then you will dig into your project folder and find the Maya file that you want to render. After that, make sure that if this project directory is not set automatically, make sure that you check it and make sure that it's actually, again, using the W letter here. Also, by default, this frames destination is turned off, just to make sure that you are going to save your files in the correct folder. Check it and make sure that it's going to save your files in the W drive in the images folder. Here you are seeing that you can define the start frame and end frame for your project. So these two parameters are going to override whatever you had originally in your Maya scene. So it will just ignore whatever number that you put here, and it will just read the numbers from here. So no matter what is the frame range in your Maya scene, you have to make sure that you're choosing the correct start frame and end frame in your job submission here. And by frame, you have to make sure that you are setting the by frame to 1, which means that you want to render all the frames. You don't want to skip any frame here. Digits here is very important because this is the zero padding concept, which means that it will add some zeros for the frame numbers that are, for example, below 10, and then below 100 it will add 10 or 20 to them, depending on how many digits you are defining here, just to make sure that at the end, when you are looking at your files in the Explorer and, for example, you want to import them in After Effects, all your files are actually sorted in the correct order. So look at this. I mean, I'm having let me see if I'm having another. Yeah, here we go. So by adding or introducing those digits in your project, in your job, you're going to add 1 or 2 or 3 zeros here, just to make sure that your files are going to be sorted in the correct way. Originally, if you just leave it as 1, I mean for the digits, the name of the files are going to be ending by 1, 2, 3, and then 10, 11, and so on, and you will see that frame 20 is going to be right after frame 2, and frame 30 is going to be right after frame 3, which is not correct. So make sure that you are adding some digits to your file names. So these are the parameters or attributes that you have to take care of when you want to submit your project. However, before doing so, I want to mention also one other important thing that you have to always make sure that you are careful about it, which is the concept of projects folder, or the importance of the projects folder. So you know that you have to, before doing anything in Maya, you have to set your project by going to set project and selecting the folder that you want to have all your files inside it. Which means that when you're done setting your projects, your Maya scenes are going to be inside the scenes folder. So you will save your scenes, your Maya scenes, inside the scenes folder, and also you will put your textures. You have to put your textures in the source images folder. You can create separate folders inside this source images folder, but you have to make sure that you are using textures in your scene that are only in the source images folder. That is very, very important, especially if you want to use that Renderfarm. And by default, when you hit render, either by using Renderfarm or going to render sequence, it will save your files in the images folder, and depending on how you set up your scene, it will create folders for render layers, and so on. So the importance of having your textures in the source images folder is that you want to make sure that when you grab your folder to some other machines, there is no broken connection between your Maya scene and the textures. However, I have noticed that sometimes, even when you set your project and you start creating some textures in your scene, and you assign some files or file textures to some of your shaders, When you select one of these file nodes, again, I'm in the Hypershade. I have selected the textures tab here just to see all the textures that I have or connected to my shaders. So I'm gonna go to my textures to be able to see the textures nodes, and I'm selecting one of the file nodes. So if I click on the file node, you will see that here in the image name or image path, the name that I'm having for the texture actually starts with source images. This is called a relative path, which is very important. Your file names are supposed to, or your paths are supposed to have a relative path, which means that, for example, if you, let me see if I have a file node that is not created correctly. Fortunately, all of these file nodes are actually correct. See, they are all starting with source images. I was hoping that I would see some errors here, but apparently I have set my project correctly. However, I want to just manually show you what happens if you are having some issues here. So for example, if you, I'm going to paste the path here. No, it's not even allowing me to paste the path. Control V. Nope. The project is set so correctly that it's not even allowing me to change the path. So the point here is that sometimes you will see that the name of the path starts with, for example, the drive letter, and then you're having your project folder on the desktop, and then your username, and then the projects folder name, and then source images, and then after that the texture file. Even though the texture is showing up in your scene, the path here is not a relative path anymore. It's called an absolute path. So for example, this is an absolute path. See, I'm having the whole path that points to this source images folder. Sometimes you will see something like this in the image path here. This is wrong. This is not a correct path that you should see in your scene. So you have to one by one go and select each one of these file nodes and make sure that all the paths here are actually relative path, which means that they are supposed to start with source images folder name. Nothing before that, not even a slash here. So I mean, it's easy to fix that. You can always select anything that is before the source images name and select them and delete them and hit enter. The connection will be updated, the texture will show up. However, if you are having more than couple file nodes here, it's going to be a tedious job for you because you have to one by one select them and then fix the path. If you are a little bit more tech savvy, you can do something else too. If your Maya file is an ASCII file, it means that you are able to open your file using any text editor. So I'm going to show you what you can do. Let me see if I'm having any file here that is actually having that issue. I hope I can find something. Let's see. So I'm going to open up this file using my text editor. If you are using a PC computer, you can use the Notepad editor, Notepad 2, which is perfect. So I'm going to open up this file using text editor. And remember, you can only do this with Maya ASCII files, not Maya binary files. All right, so the file is loaded in the text editor. And again, if you want to fix all of those absolute paths in your source images, you can do something else. You can open up your file using the text editor, look for source images. Good. So this is something that is wrong. I was hoping that I could see something like this. This path is an absolute path. It's not a relative path. So I want to fix this. And perhaps I'm going to see this error on all of my file nodes. So this is one of my file nodes. I have to remove this string here before the source images name here. So I will copy this and do another quick search. Yeah, apparently I have lots of them. So I want to replace this whole thing here with only source images. So I'm going to do a quick search and replace. Edit find and replace. I'm gonna find this string with only source images. All right, and then I'm gonna replace all of them. Replace all. All right, so now I no longer have any kind of absolute path. All the paths are changed to a relative path, and then when I save this and reopen my file in Maya, I will see that all of these issues are going to be fixed. You have to do this before submitting your job to Renderfarm. If you don't do so, it will you will have some issues with your textures. Some of the textures are not gonna load up when you see your final renders, and some of your objects will actually look black. That's because your images or the links to the images are actually broken. One other thing that I wanted to also mention that was that when you are using master software, as I said, these two numbers for the start frame and end frame are going to override whatever you had in your Maya scene as the frame range for your scene, which means that if you, for example, type in 1 to 45 for your animation sequence, it will override this frame range for all of these render layers, which means that if you've already created an override on some of your render layers, the number that you put in master software, it will override this. So regardless of what you do with these frame ranges in your scene and creating overrides on them, when you submit your job to Renderfarm, it will ignore all of these. So this is only handy if you're using your own machine and you want to render out one frame for some of your objects, for some of your render layers, and the whole sequence for your animated pieces. If you want to use Renderfarm, I will say just forget about rendering out your single frames on Renderfarm and just submit your job so you can only render your animated pieces. And if you want to do so, there's also another feature in the render layers setup that you have to be aware of, which is activating any of these render layers. So right now all of these render layers are actually activated, which means that when you start rendering this scene, it will go through all of these render layers. However, if you wanna just go and render just non-animated layers, you can deactivate, for example, the Vespa Beauty and Vespa Shadow. And now if you submit this file to Renderfarm or use the render sequence here, it will just go through these layers that are only activated. All right. So this is choosing the layers that you want to render out. So for example, if you want to render out the single frames on your machine, you will do this. You will use the render sequence. And then when you are done, you will change these and activate only the animated layers and save this file as a new file and send it over to master, and it will just go through these two layers that are activated. Also, one other thing is that make sure that since you are using render layers and you no longer need to see the master render layer, make sure that you deactivate this master render layer, because if you don't do so, you will add another layer when you want to render out your scene. So we don't want to spend time on rendering out the whole animation for the master render layer. So make sure that you deactivate that. You no longer need to see that. Also, since we are on the same concept, I want to also mention that there's also another feature on master software that is very handy sometimes. So assume that you have already submitted one job here and you want to go back and you want to only render out one of these render layers in your scene. So you can use a flag on master software here. There's a tab here that you can type in some flags. One of the flags that you can always use is a render layer flag. So the flags will start with a dash sign and then render layer, and then you will type in the name of the layer that you want to render out. So for example, I can copy the name here and paste it in the flags here. So render layer, the background beauty layer. And when I submit this job, it will only render out that single render layer that I have defined here. So sometimes it's very handy, because sometimes you don't want to upload your file, or you don't want to update your file anymore. You just want to render out one of the render layers. So you can use a flag here. So I just wanted to point that out as well. So when you're done, you will hit submit, and you will wait for your renders to show up in the images folder.